Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The decision to drive south from Moab wasn't complicated. Eric and I had talked about it over beers the month before. Just one night under open sky. Nothing technical, no permits or scrambling required. We'd both been grinding through too many months of fluorescent lights and conference calls. And the idea of sleeping where you could actually see the Milky Way felt like medicine we didn't know we needed until we said it out loud. I flew into Salt Lake City on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The flight was uneventful. The kind where you stare at the seat back and think about everything you should have finished before leaving. Eric picked me up in his truck, a '08 Silverado with 180,000 miles on it that he refused to trade in because it still started every morning. We grabbed sandwiches at a gas station deli and headed south on I-15, then cut east toward Moab through Price and Green River. The drive took 6 hours with one fuel stop and a 10-minute break where we stood in a rest area parking lot and stretched our backs while the wind tried to rip the door off its hinges. We hit Moab around 8 p.m., topped off the tank, and kept driving. The plan was to take us 191 south to US 163, then find a legal dispersed camping spot along Valley of the Gods Road before it got too late to see what we were doing. If you've never been, Valley of the Gods is Bureau of Land Management land, a 17-mile dirt road that winds between sandstone formations the size of office buildings. It's the little brother to Monument Valley, less famous but no less striking, and camping is allowed as long as you follow the rules. Existing fire rings only. Pack out everything you pack in, stay on established tracks, and don't block access. We rolled onto the dirt around 9:30. The road was washboard in places, the kind of surface that shakes your whole chassis if you go faster than 20. We crept along with the windows down, headlights cutting through dust that hung in the air like smoke. Every quarter mile or so, we'd pass a pullout with a fire ring made of stacked rocks, sometimes with tire tracks leading in, sometimes not. Most were empty. A few had RVs or trailers already set up, their propane lights glowing soft through nylon curtains. We wanted distance from other campers, not because we're antisocial, but because when you drive 6 hours to sleep under stars, you don't want to hear someone's Bluetooth speaker or see the blue flicker of a tablet through a tent wall. So we kept going, deeper into the valley, until the formations around us were just black shapes against a sky that was starting to show more stars than I'd seen in years. Around the 4-mile mark, we found a pullout beneath a sandstone butte that rose maybe 200 feet straight up. The fire ring was intact, no trash scattered around, and the ground was level enough that we wouldn't wake up sliding downhill. A dry wash ran parallel to the road about 20 yards out, marked by a line of scrub and rabbit brush that looked silver in the headlights. Beyond that, the land opened into flats that stretched for miles in every direction. "This feels like a stage," I said as I stepped out. Eric killed the engine and stood with his hands on the hood, scanning the darkness. "Yeah, but there's nobody out here to watch." He was right. We hadn't seen headlights in either direction for the last 15 minutes. The silence was immediate and total, the kind that makes you notice your own breathing. Cold air settled into the valley fast once the sun dropped, and even with a jacket on, I could feel it working through the layers. We unloaded quickly. 2 single-person tents, a cooler with ice and drinks, a small camp stove, a bag of firewood we'd picked up in Moab, and our personal gear. Eric set his tent on the north side of the fire ring. I set mine on the south, noses facing each other about 8 feet apart. We always camp that way, close enough to talk without yelling, far enough that we're not breathing on each other all night. The fire took longer to start than it should have. The wood was dry, but the wind kept shifting and killing the flame before it could catch. I used half a pack of fire starters and finally got it going with a teepee of kindling that Eric built while I held a windbreak with my jacket. Once it caught, we fed it slowly, keeping the flames low. The ring was scorched black from previous fires, and there were beer caps buried in the sand around the rocks, the aluminum kind that don't rust. We heated 2 cans of chili on the stove and ate straight from the pot with spoons we'd rinsed in bottled water. The stars came out in stages. First the bright ones, then the clusters, then the faint wash of the Milky Way that looked like someone had spilled milk across the whole dome of the sky. I've seen dark skies before, I grew up in rural Colorado, but this was different. There was no light pollution, no distant glow from a town or highway. The stars were so sharp they looked three-dimensional, like you could reach up and knock them loose. Eric pointed out Cassiopeia and Orion's belt. I showed him the two-note whistle I've used for years when I'm hiking alone and want to check in with someone ahead or behind me on the trail. It's a simple call, two notes about a half step apart. Short and clean. Not loud, but it carries. My dad taught it to me when I was a kid and we used to hike in the San Juans. He said it was better than yelling because yelling makes you sound panicked, and panicking is how you get hurt. Eric tried it a few times until he got the pitch right. We joked that we'd use it if one of us had to pee in the middle of the night and wanted to let the other know we were stepping away from the tent. It was the kind of dumb campfire conversation you have when you're tired and full and don't want to go to bed yet. The fire burned down to coals. We added one more log and let it settle. Coyotes started up somewhere out in the flats. That high yipping that sounds like laughter until you realize how many of them there are. The calls overlapped and echoed off the rock faces, making it hard to tell how far away they were. Then, all at once, they stopped. Not trailing off, not winding down, just gone, like someone had hit a switch. The silence that followed felt heavier than the one before. I looked at Eric and he looked back, and neither of us said anything. We just sat there listening to the fire pop and hiss. Around 10:15, we decided to turn in. We banked the coals with sand, lined up our boots by the truck bumper, and stashed the cooler underneath so nothing would knock it over. The tailgate was down, serving as a bench we'd been sitting on. We left it that way because it wasn't blocking anything and we'd need it again in the morning. I crawled into my tent and sealed the zipper. The sleeping bag was rated to 20 degrees, more than enough for the forecast. I took off my jacket and balled it up as a pillow, then lay on my back and listened to Eric do the same in his tent. Our tents were close enough that I could hear him shift and adjust, the nylon rustling, his breathing evening out. The last thing I remember thinking before I started to drift was how exposed we were. The butte behind us offered some shelter from the wind, but otherwise we were sitting in the open, visible from every direction. If someone wanted to walk up on us, there was nothing to stop them. No trees, no gullies, no high ground we controlled. Just two tents and a fire ring, under a sky so big it made you feel like you were already gone. I don't know what woke me, but I was instantly alert in that way you are when your body knows something is wrong before your mind catches up. My eyes were open, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, and my heart was already going faster than it should have been. The air inside the tent was cold enough that I could see my breath in the faint starlight filtering through the nylon. I held still and listened, wind moving over the butte, the creak of the truck settling on its suspension, Eric breathing in the tent next to mine, slow and steady, still asleep. Then the voice came. "You got a lighter?" It was soft, conversational, the way you'd ask a friend for something without wanting to wake anyone else nearby. It came from outside my tent, maybe 3 feet from the door, and it sounded exactly like Eric. Not similar, not close, exactly like him. Same pitch, same rhythm, same lazy way he drops the end of a sentence when he's tired. My hand moved on its own. I reached across the tent and touched Eric's shoulder through the nylon wall between us. He was right there. I could feel him breathing, the rise and fall of his ribs under my palm, his body warm and slack the way you are when you're deep asleep. The voice had been outside. My throat closed up. I pulled my hand back and held my breath, listening so hard my ears started to ring. No footsteps, no rustling of fabric, no sound of someone shifting weight or clearing their throat. Just the wind in the truck and Eric breathing inches away from me on the other side of a tent wall that suddenly felt as thin as tissue paper. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I lay there with my hand pressed flat against my chest, feeling my heart slam against my ribs, trying to make sense of what I just heard. Then 2 sharp taps hit the tailgate. Knuckle on steel. Clean, deliberate. Spaced maybe a second apart. Not the sound of something brushing against the truck or a rock rolling off the bed. 2 taps, the way you'd knock on a door to see if anyone was home. No shuffle of boots, no scrape of gravel, just the taps and then silence again. I reached for the zipper on my tent and pulled it down 2 inches, just enough to see out. The coals in the fire ring were still glowing, throwing a dim red circle of light across the sand. The truck was a black silhouette against the stars. The tailgate was down, exactly where we'd left it. And standing in the circle of red light, right at the edge of the fire ring, was a figure, tall, shoulders square, head tilted slightly to one side, like it was studying our setup. It didn't move the way a person moves when they've been standing for a while. No weight shift, no adjustment of posture. It was just there, motionless, outlined in red. I couldn't see a face. The light from the coals wasn't strong enough, and the angle was wrong. But I could see the shape of it. Human-shaped, but something about the proportions felt off in a way I couldn't name. The arms hung a little too straight. The head sat a little too high on the neck. I watched it for maybe 10 seconds. Not breathing, not blinking, my hand frozen on the zipper. Then it turned. Not like a person turns. A person leans first, shifts their weight, pivots on a heel. This thing rotated in place, the whole outline moving as one piece, and then it stepped away from the fire ring and walked toward the wash. The legs moved wrong. The knee didn't bend when the foot came down. It was subtle, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The stride was smooth and even, but the joints weren't articulating the way they should. It looked like someone walking on stilts, or someone who'd learned to walk by watching a video and hadn't quite gotten the rhythm right. I closed the zipper and pressed my mouth to the wall of Eric's tent. "Eric," I whispered. "Eric, wake up." He stirred. I heard him inhale sharply, and then his body went rigid under the sleeping bag. He didn't say anything, but I could feel him listening, the same way I was. "Something's outside," I said, barely louder than a breath. "I know," he whispered back. I heard it. We lay there in the dark, 2 grown men in 2 separate tents, and we didn't move. The next sound came from the direction of the wash. It was a cry, deep and guttural, the kind of noise a big tomcat makes when it's fighting or claiming territory. I've heard that sound before. I grew up near open fields, and you learn to recognize the difference between a house cat and something bigger, something wild. But this cry cut off too fast. It didn't trail off or rise into a yowl. It just stopped, clean, like someone had hit pause. And then it came again from behind the truck. Same pitch, same length, same abrupt stop. Not like 2 animals calling to each other, but like the same sound played twice, copied and pasted with the timing slightly off. "That's not right," Eric whispered. "I know. What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to stay put, stay quiet, stay invisible. But another part of me, the part that doesn't like being backed into a corner, wanted to see what we were dealing with. I needed to know if it was a person messing with us or an animal acting strange, or something else I didn't have a name for yet. "I'm going to unzip and look," I said. "Don't freak out when I turn on the headlamp." "Okay." On 3. We counted together under our breath. 1, 2, 3. I unzipped my tent in one smooth pull, and swung the headlamp in a low arc across the camp. Eric did the same from his side, and for a moment the whole area lit up in 2 overlapping beams. The camp looked normal. Fire ring with white coals glowing faintly. Truck parked where we'd left it. Tailgate down. Boots lined up. Cooler underneath. No footprints around the fire ring that weren't ours. No sign that anyone had walked through. I stepped out, keeping the light low. Eric followed. We didn't say anything, just moved together toward the wash with our lights sweeping the ground. The first thing I found made my stomach drop. In the dust at the lip of the wash, there was a single line of bare footprints, human-looking. Not small, maybe a size 11 or 12. The toes were splayed a little, the way feet get when someone walks barefoot a lot, and the bones spread naturally. But they weren't alone. The footprints cut straight across a set of fresh coyote tracks. And for several steps, maybe 6 or 7, the spacing matched exactly. Human print, coyote pads, human print, coyote pads, same rhythm, same stride length, like the 2 sets of tracks had been laid down by the same thing moving in the same cadence. I crouched and put my hand next to one of the prints. My fingers didn't come close to spanning it. The toes had dug in deeper than the heels, like the foot was landing wrong, pushing off the front instead of rolling through the step. The coyote pads did the same thing for those same steps. Deeper at the front, lighter at the back, and then the coyote tracks drifted away and came back into sync again, a few yards later. I measured the stride the way my dad taught me. Heel of one print to heel of the next. 40 inches, give or take. That's a long stride for someone walking. That's a running stride. Or close to it. But the depth and spacing were even. No variation. No stumble or adjustment. "What the hell?" Eric said quietly. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was trying to tell myself that wind does strange things to sand, that distances and angles play tricks in starlight, that there had to be a rational explanation for why these tracks looked like they'd been made by the same set of legs switching between 2 feet and 4 paws mid-stride. But I didn't believe it. I knew what I was looking at, and I knew it wasn't right. I stood up and backed away from the wash, my light still on the ground. I was maybe 10 yards from the truck when I gave our 2-note whistle, just to let Eric know I was coming back and not to startle. It's a small sound, quiet. We'd only been using it for a few hours. The same 2 notes answered from up the road. Then the same 2 notes came from down in the wash. Not overlapping, not echoed. One, then the other, each with the same clipped little gap between the notes, the same pitch, the same cadence I've used for 15 years. It was my whistle, my call, coming from 2 directions at once. I stood there with the headlamp aimed at my feet, feeling every hair on my arm stand straight up. My hands started to shake. I clenched them into fists and forced myself to breathe. Eric swung his light toward the road. For just a second, the beam caught something at the edge of the packed dirt. A tall silhouette, shoulders square, head tilted, and then it was gone, swallowed by brush and shadow. "We're leaving," Eric said. "Yeah. Right now." "Yeah." We moved fast but didn't panic. Panicking gets you hurt. It makes you trip, makes you drop things, makes you forget steps that matter. We'd both been camping long enough to know that packing in the dark requires a system, and we stuck to it even though every nerve in my body was screaming to run. I went to the fire ring first. We'd banked the coals with sand, but I wanted to make sure they were dead before we left. I pulled the sand away with a stick and poured the last of our bottled water over the embers, raking them until I could hold my hand an inch above the ring without feeling heat. The hiss of water on coals sounded too loud, and the steam that rose smelled like wet ash and something else I couldn't name. Eric broke down his tent without rolling it, just pulled the stakes and wadded the whole thing into a stuff sack. I did the same with mine. We threw everything into the bed of the truck. Tents, sleeping bags, stove, firewood, personal gear, no organization, no care, just get it in and get moving. The cooler went in last. We swung the tailgate shut, and it latched with a metallic thunk that echoed off the butte behind us. That's when I realized my hand was fidgeting with my lighter. I'd pulled it out of my pocket without thinking, and now I was flipping it open and closed, the little click of the hinge loud in the silence. I couldn't seem to stop. My thumb kept moving on its own, and each time the lighter clicked, I felt a spike of adrenaline in my chest, like I'd just heard something I shouldn't have. Eric looked at me. "You good?" "Yeah." "Then get in." We climbed in and shut the doors as quietly as we could. Seatbelts on. Keys in the ignition. I started the truck and kept the headlights on low beam so we wouldn't blind ourselves on the washboard. The engine sounded too loud, too alive, like we were announcing ourselves to everything in a 10-mile radius. I put it in drive and eased onto the road, keeping it around 25. Any faster and we'd hit a rut we couldn't see, and blow a tire or worse. The surface was rough, the kind that shakes your teeth and makes the truck rattle like it's going to fall apart. I cracked the windows because I wanted to hear if anything got close. Eric didn't argue. He just sat there with both hands on the door handle, knuckles white, staring out the passenger side mirror. Dust rolled up behind us in thick clouds that glowed red in the taillights. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, watching for rocks or dips that would catch the axle, but I couldn't help glancing at the rearview mirror every few seconds. And that's when I saw it. Between the clouds of dust, in the space where the road was still visible, the figure was pacing us. Not running, not sprinting, just moving, keeping up with the truck at 25 miles per hour without any visible effort. The outline was the same. Tall, shoulders square, legs moving with that wrong articulation, and it stayed maybe 50 yards back, appearing for a few seconds at a time before the dust swallowed it again. I told myself it was a trick of the headlights. I told myself it was a shadow, a rock formation, a coyote caught in the beam. I told myself anything that would keep my foot steady on the gas and not slam down and send us careening into a wash we couldn't see. But I didn't believe any of it. Twice I caught the figure in the passenger side mirror. Closer than it should have been. Right at the edge of the road. Same wrong motion. Same smooth, even stride. And then it was gone. The wash cutting the light. And I didn't see it again for another 100 yards. Every couple of minutes our two-note call sounded from the side of the road. Not from behind us. From the side. Like it was running parallel, or ahead, or everywhere at once. The timing was too perfect, too clean, like a recording played on a loop instead of something made with breath and effort. My hand kept clicking the lighter. Open, closed, open, closed. I couldn't stop. And each time I did it, the call came back 2 beats later, like it was counting with me, like it was keeping time. "Don't stop," Eric said without looking at me. "Don't stop for anything." I'm not stopping. If it gets in front of us, I'm not stopping. We passed a small ranch gate with a cattle guard and a low tin sign. I couldn't read in the dark. A dog lifted from the porch and came at the fence, barking in deep, steady barks that carried across the flats.
Big dog. Working dog. The kind ranchers keep to guard livestock from coyotes, and worse.
The figure in the mirror changed course. No hesitation, no pause. It veered away from the road like it had hit a boundary, angling off into the scrub and disappearing from the mirror. The dog kept barking, and the sound didn't break or falter. It was full-throated, aggressive, the kind of bark that says something dangerous is too close and needs to leave now. We kept driving. The dog's barking faded behind us, and I realized I was breathing normally again for the first time since we'd left the camp. "What the hell was that?" Eric said. "I don't know." It was keeping up. "I know. That's not possible." "I know." We didn't stop at the turnout where we'd normally check the tire pressure or stretch our legs. We came up on the curve where you can see Mexican Hat Rock silhouetted against the sky, and then the lights of the gas station appeared ahead like a beacon. We pulled under the canopy and parked right in the wash of the fluorescent lights. Doors locked. Windows up. Seats upright. No tough talk. No what the hell was that. No theories or explanations. Just the tired, shaky silence of 2 people who'd used up all their words a few miles back and didn't have any left. I didn't sleep. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, staring at the gas pumps, while Eric leaned his head against the window and stared at nothing. Every pair of headlights that passed on Nawas 163 made my shoulders jump, even though the drivers were just locals heading to work or home or wherever locals go at 5 in the morning. The sun came up slowly, turning the sky from black to purple to pale blue. The formations around Mexican Hat started to glow orange, and the world looked normal again, like the night before had been something we'd imagined. But I still had sand in my boots. I still had the image of those footprints burned into my head. I still heard my own whistle coming from 2 directions at once. And I still couldn't stop clicking the lighter. Around 8 a.m., a white BLM truck pulled into the gas station and parked at the pump across from us. The ranger who stepped out was older, maybe late 50s, with sun-creased skin and the kind of calm, weathered look you get from spending most of your life outside. He wore the standard uniform, tan shirt, green pants, flat-brimmed hat, and moved with the economy of someone who knows how to pace himself in the heat. He started fueling his truck, glanced over at us and frowned slightly. We must have looked rough. Neither of us had slept. I had dust in my hair and on my jacket. Eric's eyes were red-rimmed and distant. The ranger finished fueling, hung up the nozzle, and walked over. He didn't come right up to the window. He stopped a respectful few feet back and leaned slightly so he could see both of us. "You boys doing all right?" he asked. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say we were fine, that we just had a rough night camping and were heading home. But another part of me, maybe the part that still felt like I was being watched even in broad daylight, wanted to tell him everything. "We're okay," I said. "Just had a weird night." "Weird how?" I glanced at Eric. He nodded slightly, so I unlocked the door and stepped out. The air was already warming up, and the light felt harsh after sitting in the truck. I told the ranger we'd been camped off Valley of the Gods Road, and that we'd had a visitor who didn't walk right, and didn't sound right. I left out the part about the footprints matching cadence with the coyote tracks. I left out the part about seeing the figure pace us in the mirror. I didn't want him to think we were hysterical or making things up. The ranger listened without interrupting. When I finished, he took off his hat and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "You want me to follow you back and check the fire ring?" he asked. "Make sure you didn't leave it hot?" "Yeah," I said. "If you don't mind." "I don't mind. That's the job." We got back in the truck and led him out of the gas station, back onto US 163, and then onto the dirt road that led into Valley of the Gods. Driving it in daylight felt surreal. The formations that had been black cutouts in the dark were now glowing red and orange, massive and beautiful and completely benign. The road looked like any other dirt track, washboard in places but nothing dangerous. I couldn't reconcile it with the place we'd fled from a few hours earlier. We reached our campsite around 9:30. The fire ring was still there, white ash scattered across the rocks. Our boot prints were everywhere, along with the tracks from the truck. The wash looked like a wash, just sand and scrub, and empty space. The ranger got out and walked to the fire ring. He crouched down, sifted the ash with his fingers and nodded. "You did good," he said. "It's cold." Then he stood and walked toward the wash without me saying anything. I hadn't pointed it out. I hadn't mentioned the tracks. But he went straight there, like he knew what he was looking for. He crouched at the edge and ran 2 fingers along the rim of one of the prints. He studied it for a long time, long enough that I started to feel uncomfortable. Then he glanced up the road the way I'd pointed when I was telling the story, and let his breath out through his nose. "Lot of open ground out here," he said. "Sound travels. Distances play tricks." He paused. "You boys not from around here?" "No, sir. Colorado and California." He nodded slowly, like that explained something. He looked at the prints again, at the way the toes dug in deeper than the heels, at the spacing, at the way they crossed the coyote tracks and matched cadence for a few steps before drifting apart. He didn't say anything about animals. He didn't say anything about people. He didn't ask us to make a report or fill out paperwork. He just stood, brushed the dust off his palms, and gave the kind of shrug that said he had a drawer in his head full of things he couldn't put in a file. "If you're new to these flats," he said finally, "camp closer to town." That was it. No explanation. No theory. Just advice. He reminded us to stick to existing campsites, pack out all trash, mind the private ranch turnoffs, and keep fires low. He didn't add "and don't go looking for whatever that was," because he didn't have to. We understood. He got back in his truck and drove off without looking back. We stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle, and then we packed up properly this time. We rolled the tents instead of stuffing them. We organized the gear in the bed. We didn't take a last look at the wash, or try to photograph the prints or pick up a souvenir rock. We just got in and drove toward US 163, took the left toward Bluff, and let the miles do their job. We didn't talk much on the drive north. Eric stared out the window at the passing rock formations, and I kept my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road. Every few miles I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure pacing us again, but all I saw was empty highway and blue sky. Around noon we stopped for gas in Blanding. Eric went inside to buy coffee and snacks while I filled the tank. The station was busy. Families on road trips, retirees in RVs, a couple of motorcyclists comparing maps. Normal people doing normal things. It felt like we'd crossed into a different world, one where the night before didn't exist. Eric came back with 2 coffees and a bag of chips. We sat in the truck with the doors open, eating in silence. After a while, he spoke. "You think that Ranger knew something?" "Yeah." But he didn't say anything. "No. Why not?" I didn't have an answer. Maybe he'd been told not to. Maybe he'd learned the hard way that some things don't fit in reports. Maybe he'd seen enough over the years to know that the desert had its own rules, and the best you could do was warn people without scaring them off completely. He said to camp closer to town. I said finally, "That's probably all the answer we're going to get." Eric nodded and crumpled the chip bag into a ball. "You ever going back?" "No. Me neither." We finished our coffee and got back on the road. By the time we hit Moab, the sun was high and hot, and the events of the previous night felt distant, like a story someone else had told me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing in the red glow of the coals, head tilted, motionless. Every time the truck hit a bump, I heard the 2 taps on the tailgate, and every time I reached for something in my pocket, my hand found the lighter and started clicking it before I could stop myself. Eric dropped me off at the airport in Salt Lake City the next afternoon. We shook hands in the passenger drop-off lane and he said, "Let's do this again sometime." "Sure," I said, "but closer to town." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes.
Yeah, closer to town.
I flew home and tried to put it behind me. I told myself it was just a bad night, that we'd gotten spooked by sounds and shadows, that the desert plays tricks on people who aren't used to it. I told myself a lot of things, but I kept thinking about the tracks, about the way they matched the coyote pads for 6 or 7 steps. Same rhythm, same stride, like something had been walking on 2 feet and 4 paws at the same time. About the way my own whistle had answered itself from 2 directions, perfect pitch, perfect timing. I started researching. I read about acoustic anomalies in desert environments, about how temperature inversions can carry sounds for miles and make them seem like they're coming from multiple directions. I read about how cold air and low humidity can make sounds sharper, clearer, more immediate. I read about pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, to interpret ambiguous stimuli as something familiar. None of it explained what we'd seen. None of it explained the tracks. None of it explained how the figure had kept pace with a truck moving at 25 miles per hour without breaking stride. I called Eric a few weeks later. He sounded tired. "You doing okay?" I asked. "Yeah. You?" "Yeah." There was a long silence. "You still thinking about it?" he asked. "Every day." "Me too." We talked for a while about nothing in particular. Work, weather, plans for the holidays. Neither of us mentioned Valley of the Gods by name, but it hung between us like a weight we were both carrying and couldn't put down. Before we hung up, Eric said, "You ever figure out what that was?" "No." "You going to keep looking?" "No." "Good," he said. "Me neither. I'm writing this now because I can't keep replaying it in my head every time my house gets quiet. I need to put it down somewhere, get it out, and maybe that will help me stop flinching every time I hear my own voice echo off a wall or a car passes too slowly on my street. People are going to say the desert plays tricks, and they're right. Cold air carries voices a long way. Starlight flattens distances into 2-dimensional pictures. Animals act strange when they're sick or injured, and people see what they expect to see when they're tired and scared. But I know my friend's voice, and I know how a knee is supposed to bend. I know the difference between 2 animals calling to each other and the same sound played twice with the timing slightly off. I know the sound of knuckles on metal. I know my own 2-note whistle, the one I've used for 15 years, and I know it shouldn't have answered itself from 2 directions at once with the same tight cadence and perfect pitch. If you want me to put a label on it, there are words that locals use for things like this. I've read about them since that night. Entities that walk in multiple forms, that mimic voices, that follow travelers in open country. But I'm not going to throw those words around to sound cool or informed, because I don't know if they're real, and I don't want to pretend I do. What I know is this. Whatever was outside our tents that night felt human in the way that makes your body say no before your mind does. It wanted our attention more than our gear. It called in Eric's voice. It answered in mine. It moved wrong. It kept pace. And when it got too close to something that could fight back, a dog with teeth and territory, it left. That's the worst part, I think. Not that it was there, but that it wanted something from us. That it was trying to communicate, or lure, or test. That it had intent. There's no twist ending here. No return trip to prove what happened. No late-night investigation with recording equipment and theories. A ranger told us to camp closer to town if we weren't used to the open desert, and we weren't, and we left on purpose and kept that promise. I still like the Red Rock. I still go hiking. But if I'm out there after dark now, I keep lights close and fences closer, and I don't whistle. I don't answer if I hear my own voice call back. And I never ever camp where I can't see the lights of town. I'd driven through Navajo country dozens of times, working the oil fields near Farmington, but I'd never lingered long enough to absorb much beyond the scenery. My younger brother Raymond had never even been this far north. We'd planned a road trip from Santa Fe, pushing northwest through Arizona's Four Corners and into Monument Valley, hoping to snap pictures of Shiprock Peak at sunrise. Raymond, who fancied himself a photographer, insisted that golden hour at Shiprock was worth skipping a motel stay for. I'd reluctantly agreed, thinking the drive would be smooth enough. Around midnight, we turned off the main highway, heading north on Navajo Route 33 through Cove Chapter, aiming for a shortcut Raymond had found through Red Valley. I felt good about the route. I'd vaguely remembered driving parts of it before during a supply run back in 2017, but the optimism faded quickly. The road stretched endlessly before us, unmarked and increasingly rough. Potholes appeared without warning in our headlight beams, forcing me to swerve suddenly. The truck's suspension groaned with each jolt. Raymond sat beside me, camera equipment carefully stowed in the back seat, studying the route on his phone before the signal finally died completely. He'd been excited earlier, talking endlessly about aperture settings and exposure times, but now he'd grown quiet, watching the darkness swallow the landscape around us. About an hour past Cove, just as we passed Sawmill Trail, I noticed the temperature gauge needle jump suddenly into the red. The dashboard light glowed ominously, casting an orange reflection across the windshield. "Julian, something's wrong," Raymond said, leaning forward anxiously, his voice tight with concern. "I see it," I muttered, pulling the truck onto the shoulder. There was a sandstone bluff overlooking a wide valley, lit dimly by a thin crescent moon. The visibility was poor, shapes barely distinguishable from shadows. I killed the engine immediately, letting the truck roll to a stop on the gravel shoulder. Stepping out into the biting winter air, we popped the hood, letting steam spill upward into the darkness. The smell of hot metal and coolant filled my nostrils. I shone my flashlight down into the engine compartment and saw what I had feared. The radiator was almost empty. Fluid pooled beneath the truck, staining the sand dark. My stomach sank. We had water in the back, but pouring it into a hot engine risked cracking the radiator block, leaving us stranded for good. We had no choice but to wait until morning and let things cool off naturally. Raymond rubbed his gloved hands together and shook his head, breath forming vapor clouds in the frigid air. Perfect timing. "At least we have blankets and snacks," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though my own confidence was wavering. The temperature had to be in the low 20s, maybe colder. Wind cut through the valley with a sharpness that stung exposed skin. Raymond was clearly uncomfortable, glancing nervously toward the dark ridgelines that surrounded us on three sides. The landscape felt oppressive in its emptiness, vast and indifferent. There was no cell service, of course, not way out here. The nearest town was probably 30 miles in any direction. We settled back into the truck cab, trying to find comfortable positions, preparing ourselves mentally to endure a cold, restless night. I pulled a heavy wool blanket from behind the seat and draped it across both of us. Raymond curled against the passenger door, arms folded tightly, breath visible in the cold air despite the insulation. Raymond drifted off after about half an hour, his breathing becoming slow and rhythmic. I tried to follow suit, but found myself restless, staring through the windshield into the darkness. The moon provided barely enough light to outline the nearest rock formations. Everything beyond 30 feet dissolved into blackness. My mind wandered, thinking about the work I'd left behind, the deliveries scheduled for next week, wondering if my supervisor would understand the delay. The oil fields operated on strict timelines. Missing a delivery meant lost contracts, lost income, but there was nothing to be done about it now. It was around 2 in the morning when I first heard the sound, a deep, low howl carrying far across the valley. I knew coyotes well enough from my years working these lands. This wasn't a coyote. This was longer, lower, almost human in its tonal quality, but raw and animalistic at the same time. The sound seemed to wrap around the truck, coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The hairs on my neck prickled instantly, and I nudged Raymond awake, perhaps more forcefully than necessary. "You hear that?" He sat up slowly, eyes unfocused and bleary. "Hear what?" As if answering, the howl came again, closer this time, and from the opposite ridge. The sound was clearer now, more distinct. There was something wrong about it, something that triggered an instinctive alarm deep in my primitive brain. Raymond stiffened instantly, staring into the darkness, suddenly fully awake. "What is that?" he whispered.
"No idea," I said, trying to mask my unease. "Maybe an elk or something." Even as I spoke, I knew it was a lie. I'd heard elk bugling during hunting season. This was nothing like that.
Raymond shook his head, his eyes locked forward, hands gripping his knees. I've never heard an elk sound like that. We sat frozen for several long minutes, listening intently. The wind had died completely, leaving an eerie stillness that amplified every small sound. The creak of the truck settling, the faint whistle of air through a gap in the door seal, our own breathing. Against my better judgment, we stepped out of the truck again, straining our eyes in the dim moonlight. The valley stretched ahead of us, dark and silent now. The howls had faded into echoes that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. My boots crunched softly on the gravel, each step sounding impossibly loud. Just as we turned to get back into the truck, Raymond grabbed my arm, pointing wordlessly at the sandstone ridge across the road. His grip was tight, fingers digging into my jacket sleeve. I followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness. My heart began hammering violently. Standing on the top of the outcrop was a tall figure, backlit by moonlight, a dark silhouette hunched and elongated. It looked oddly twisted, limbs longer than seemed possible, its stance almost predatory. The proportions were all wrong. The torso was too narrow, the legs too long, bent at angles that didn't match human anatomy. The thing was silent, completely still, like a statue carved from the darkness itself. We watched, frozen ourselves, unwilling or unable to move. My rational mind screamed explanations. A tree, a rock formation, shadows playing tricks. But my instincts knew better. This was alive. This was watching us. Then it tilted its head back slowly, deliberately, and let out a howl identical to the ones we just heard. The sound was deafeningly loud, unmistakably animal, yet disturbingly human in its undertones. It carried pain and hunger in equal measure. Raymond took a step backward, breathing hard. Julian. I slowly reached into the truck, opening the center console with trembling fingers and gripping the revolver I'd stashed there. A .357 Magnum I'd carried for years while working remote sites. My fingers shook as I loaded rounds into the chamber, the metallic clicks seeming impossibly loud. I never took my eyes off the figure on the ridge. We both stood perfectly still, as if locked in some silent standoff. My heart hammered in my chest, every muscle tensed and ready to bolt. Sweat formed on my palms despite the cold. The figure remained motionless, and for a brief moment I wondered if we were staring at nothing, if fear had conjured something from shadows and moonlight. Then, without warning, the thing began to descend from the ridge. It moved strangely, its limbs jerking as if unsure how to carry its own weight. Something in its movement seemed almost bird-like, awkward in its precision, yet terrifyingly deliberate. Each step was calculated, careful, like a predator approaching prey. "Get back in the truck," I whispered sharply, barely able to force the words through my constricted throat. Raymond obeyed immediately, scrambling inside with frantic movements, but I held my ground, raising the revolver with both hands, trying to steady my aim. The weapon felt heavy, inadequate against whatever was approaching. The creature paused about 50 yards away, and under the faint glow of moonlight, I saw its head clearly for the first time. Elongated, snout-like, with eyes that reflected in the dark like an animal's. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing what appeared to be sharp, irregular teeth. The facial structure was wrong, caught somewhere between canine and human, belonging fully to neither. Then it dropped to all fours. I expected it to charge at us, to rush forward in a final terrifying assault. But instead, impossibly, it began crawling swiftly backward up the slope, its grotesque form moving with unnatural speed. The movement defied logic, defied physics. Its joints bent in ways that shouldn't have been possible, limbs extending and contracting fluidly. Within seconds, it vanished behind a large boulder near the ridge top. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as I climbed into the truck. My legs felt weak, unreliable. We sat wordlessly in shock, doors locked, breathing raggedly, as we stared out into the silent darkness. I kept the revolver clenched in my sweaty palm, knowing that rest wouldn't come again until dawn. The digital clock on the dashboard read 2:47 a.m. Sunrise was still hours away. For the next hour, neither of us said a word. We sat in stunned silence, breath fogging the windows, eyes locked on the sandstone bluff. The truck cab felt cramped, suffocating despite the cold. My palm was sweaty around the revolver grip, finger resting nervously along the trigger guard. Raymond shivered next to me, fists clenched tightly in his lap, knuckles white. I tried convincing myself we'd imagined it, that fear and exhaustion had warped reality into something monstrous. But every time I closed my eyes, the image was clear, its long limbs bending at unnatural angles, its head tilted back, howling into the night sky. The sound still echoed clearly in my memory, impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. Julian, what the hell was that thing? Raymond finally broke the silence, his voice barely audible above the thrum of adrenaline in my ears. I don't know, I whispered back, eyes still fixed ahead on the darkness. Let's just stay quiet. He nodded, leaning forward slightly, eyes scanning the darkness outside with frantic intensity. The moon had shifted position, offering barely enough light to outline shapes beyond the truck. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the sand, shifting with every passing cloud. The landscape seemed alive, moving, threatening. Minutes dragged on endlessly. My eyes burned from staring unblinkingly at the same vista, afraid to even blink in case something approached during that fraction of a second. My neck ached from the tension, muscles locked tight. Then Raymond stiffened suddenly, his back pressed hard against the seat. "It's back," he breathed. I leaned forward, squinting into the gloom, scanning the ridgeline where we'd first seen the figure. At first nothing seemed different, just the same desolate landscape of rock and brush, painted in shades of black and gray. But as my eyes adjusted, focusing on the middle distance, I saw movement near the base of the ridge. It stood upright now, frozen in place, staring directly toward us. Even from this distance I could feel the weight of its gaze, could sense the intelligence behind those reflecting eyes. My heart slammed violently in my chest, pulse roaring in my ears. Without warning, the creature began descending again, this time more rapidly. It moved with that same bizarre gait, knees turning inward, stepping forward in jerky, halting motions that looked painful. Its limbs swung awkwardly too long for its body, like a puppet with strings pulled by an amateur handler. Each stride felt unnatural, disconnected, like it was trying to imitate something human but failing horribly. "It's coming this way." Raymond's voice trembled, panic seeping through every syllable. I gripped the revolver tighter, swallowing hard against the dryness in my throat. Stay calm. But calm felt impossible. My entire body screamed at me to run, to start the engine and flee regardless of the consequences to the radiator. Only the knowledge that we might not make it a mile before breaking down completely kept me frozen in place. The figure dropped onto all fours again, head still locked forward in our direction, and began crawling fast, disturbingly fluid but backward. The speed was shocking, covering ground impossibly quickly, like watching a film play in reverse at double speed. Raymond's breath hitched sharply beside me. Oh God, oh God. I fumbled for the flashlight in the center console, desperate to see clearly, to understand what we were facing. My fingers closed around the metal cylinder and I yanked it free, snapping it on and aiming the bright beam straight toward the approaching form. It froze instantly, bathed in the harsh white glare. My stomach twisted violently. The creature stood slowly, rising to its full height in the flashlight beam. It was taller than I'd guessed, nearly 7 feet, maybe more. Its long limbs hung loosely from its gaunt frame, covered unevenly with patches of dark fur that looked matted and filthy. In places, bare skin stretched tight over visible ribs, pale gray under the beam of light, almost translucent. But worst of all was its head, elongated, canine-like, but with a flattened face that suggested something more than simple animal. The eyes reflected back a sickly yellow glow, unblinking, fixed on us with an intensity that felt almost personal. Its jaw was partially open, revealing rows of sharp, irregular teeth that looked designed for tearing flesh. "Shoot it!" Raymond shouted frantically, his voice cracking with terror. I raised the revolver skyward with shaking hands and squeezed the trigger. The sharp crack of the gunshot reverberated across the valley, echoing off distant canyon walls. The muzzle flash illuminated everything for a split second. The creature, the rocks, Raymond's terrified face beside me. The creature recoiled sharply at the sound, its head jerking backward as if struck. For a moment I thought I'd hit it, but no, it was reacting to the noise itself, to the sudden violence of the sound in the silent night. Then, without hesitation, it dropped once more to all fours. With a speed I'd never imagined possible, it bolted sideways, moving perpendicular to us, disappearing instantly behind a cluster of rocks 30 yards to our left. The movement was fluid, predatory, efficient. My hands shook uncontrollably. I glanced at Raymond, whose eyes were wide, pupils dilated with pure terror, his face drained of color even in the dim light. Neither of us moved or spoke. We barely breathed. The revolver felt inadequate now, small and useless against whatever was out there. 6 rounds, that's all I had, and I'd just wasted one firing into empty air. For another long stretch of silence, we waited, too frightened to even shift position. I kept the flashlight pointed toward where the creature had vanished, but saw nothing. Just rock and shadow and empty space. Then, from behind us, a faint scratching noise started. Metallic, scraping gently along the truck bed. The sound was deliberate, methodical, like fingers dragging across steel. Julian Raymond hissed softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I hear it," I answered through clenched teeth, glancing into the rearview mirror. Nothing showed in the limited view, but the sound continued. A careful, deliberate scraping along the metal surface. My nerves felt raw, exposed. Every instinct screamed at me not to leave the truck, not to expose myself, but I couldn't sit here blind, not knowing what was happening behind us. Slowly, cautiously, I cracked open the driver's door, flashlight in one hand, revolver in the other. The cold air rushed in immediately. My pulse hammered painfully in my ears, so loud I was certain anything outside could hear it. Stepping out, I shined the beam toward the back of the truck. Heart lodged in my throat, finger tight on the trigger. The bed was empty. No marks, no footprints, no animal or shape retreating into the darkness. Only sand and rock, quiet and still. The tailgate was latched, undisturbed. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the surrounding area with the flashlight, trying to understand what I'd heard. The wind had picked up slightly, perhaps enough to move something loose in the bed, but I knew that wasn't it. The sound had been too deliberate, too consistent. I climbed back inside, locking the doors firmly behind me. Neither of us relaxed. Raymond stared forward blankly, arms folded tightly across his chest, breathing shallow and rapid. "What's happening?" he finally asked, his voice small and lost. "I don't know," I admitted quietly. "I honestly don't know." By 4:30, the world beyond the windshield felt lifeless, suspended in that peculiar darkness that exists in the hours before dawn. The moon had set, leaving only starlight, thousands of points of light that did nothing to illuminate the ground. I'd kept the flashlight on for a while, sweeping it periodically across the landscape, but the battery was dying and I needed to conserve it. We sat in near total darkness now, relying on what little our eyes could gather from the stars above. Then I caught movement again on the ridge ahead. Not the same location as before, but further east, closer to where the road curved around the bluff. This time it wasn't just one figure. It was several. Shadows crouched low, perched silently along the sandstone rim like gargoyles on a cathedral. I counted at least 4, maybe 5 distinct shapes, spaced evenly along the ridge. They didn't advance, didn't howl, didn't move at all. They just waited, unmoving, eyes reflecting dully in the thin starlight. My throat constricted. Raymond let out a long, shaky breath beside me. "They're watching us," he whispered numbly. "I know," I murmured back, dread settling heavy inside me like a physical weight. "We just have to make it to sunrise." The figures remained perfectly still, maintaining their positions like sentries. I couldn't tell if they were the same creature we'd seen earlier or different ones. The distance and darkness made it impossible to distinguish details, but the posture was similar: too tall, too angular, wrong in fundamental ways. Minutes passed like hours. I kept glancing at the dashboard clock, willing it to move faster. 4:52, 5:03. Raymond had closed his eyes at some point, though I knew he wasn't sleeping. His breathing was too irregular, too controlled. He was simply trying to retreat somewhere inside himself, somewhere safer than this truck surrounded by things that shouldn't exist. Around 5:15, one of the figures on the ridge stood slowly, rising to its full height. Even at this distance, the movement was unmistakable, fluid and disturbing. It turned its head slowly, scanning the valley, then dropped back down to its crouch. They were communicating somehow, coordinating. The realization sent ice through my veins. I dealt with predators before, mountain lions, bears, even a pack of feral dogs once. But those were animals, operating on instinct and hunger. This felt different. This felt intelligent, purposeful. Julian, Raymond said quietly, eyes still closed. If we don't make it, don't. I cut him off sharply. Don't talk like that. We're going to be fine. He opened his eyes, looking at me directly for the first time in over an hour. You don't believe that. He was right. I didn't. But saying it aloud would make it real. Would give the fear permission to consume us completely. Dawn is coming, I said instead, more to convince myself than him. Whatever they are, they'll leave when the sun rises. How do you know? I didn't answer, because I didn't know. It was nothing more than desperate hope, a prayer to any god who might be listening. When the first faint glow of sunrise began to seep over the horizon, it felt as if the weight pressing on my chest finally loosened. The sky transformed slowly from black to deep purple, then to shades of pink and orange that painted the canyon walls with color. Raymond was still rigid beside me, gripping his knees as if bracing for another nightmare to emerge. Neither of us had managed even a moment of real rest after seeing those things watching silently from the ridgeline. In the pale dawn, everything around us slowly transformed. The jagged cliffs softened into shades of red and gold, the dark brush brightening into greens and browns, the landscape becoming more familiar, less threatening. Normal. I scanned the ridgeline anxiously, searching for the figures we'd seen throughout the night. The outcrop was empty now. Nothing but rock and sparse vegetation. They'd vanished sometime in the last hour, retreating to wherever they'd come from. I forced myself out of the truck, legs stiff and shaky from hours of immobility. My breath fogged in the morning chill as I moved cautiously toward the hood, revolver still firmly in hand. The weight of it had become familiar, comforting even. Raymond followed, nervously scanning the hills as I lifted the hood and peered inside. The radiator had cooled down enough now, steam no longer rising from the components. With careful, slow movements, I began pouring water from our reserve into the reservoir. It trickled and gurgled quietly, steam rising slightly, but no longer violently hissing like before. I breathed a small sigh of relief. Think it'll hold? Raymond asked, voice low and cautious, eyes never leaving the surrounding landscape. It better, I muttered, tightening the cap carefully. We're not staying here any longer. Just as I twisted the radiator cap shut, the quiet hum of tires on pavement approached from the distance, startling both of us. We turned quickly, shielding our eyes against the glare of morning sun, and watched as a white utility truck slowed and pulled up on the roadside behind us. An older Navajo man climbed out, dressed in worn coveralls with a weathered face that showed years of working outdoors. His expression was calm, unreadable as he moved toward us. He glanced briefly at the revolver I was still gripping, but made no comment.
Trouble with your vehicle?
He asked plainly, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of the region. Embarrassed, I tucked the weapon into my waistband. Overheated, I answered cautiously, studying his face for any reaction. Think it'll be okay now. The man nodded thoughtfully, his eyes calmly scanning the valley beyond us, taking in the landscape with the familiarity of someone who traveled these roads countless times. Without further comment, he walked back to his truck, pulled a large plastic jug from behind the seat, and returned to hand it to me. Here, drink some water. We drank gratefully, the water cold and sharp, helping to clear the fog of exhaustion and fear. The simple act of drinking, of performing something normal and human, helped ground us back in reality. The man watched patiently as we finished, never once questioning why two young men looked so pale and shaken in the early morning chill. His eyes were kind but knowing, as if he understood more than he was saying. Finally, he gestured vaguely toward the canyon walls and the sandstone ridges that stretched across the horizon. He spoke softly but clearly, choosing his words with care. You boys should head out now, he advised gently. Things move between those canyons when the moon is thin. Best not to linger. His tone carried certainty, not superstition. He'd lived here, knew these lands and their secrets better than we ever could. There was no judgment in his voice, only pragmatic warning. Raymond and I exchanged a glance, both knowing it was time to leave. No explanations, no questions. The man's warning had been clear enough. and we had no desire to test its accuracy. "Thank you," I managed, returning the water jug. He accepted it with a slight nod. "Drive safe. Stay on the main roads." We climbed back into our truck, movements mechanical, operating on autopilot. As I turned the key, the engine rumbled smoothly to life, bringing instant relief that washed over me like warm water. The sound was beautiful, normal, reliable, everything the night had not been. Without looking back, I guided us carefully onto the road, headed toward 191. Neither of us spoke as we drove south, shadows gradually shrinking under the climbing sun. In the rearview mirror, I watched the sandstone bluffs recede into the distance, becoming smaller and less threatening with each passing mile. The Navajo man's truck remained parked on the shoulder, a white speck against the red landscape. I wondered how long he'd stay there, if he was waiting for something, or simply making sure we actually left. At the junction leading toward Shiprock, Raymond pointed hesitantly ahead. "Should we still try for the photos?" he asked, voice weak, almost uncertain. "No," I said firmly, not even considering it. "We're going west through Montezuma Creek. We're leaving Arizona behind." He nodded quietly, visibly relieved, leaning back against his seat, closing his eyes briefly for the first time since the night began. The tension in his shoulders began to ease slightly as the miles accumulated between us and Red Valley. The landscape gradually changed as we drove, becoming more populated, more civilized. Gas stations appeared, then small houses, then actual towns with traffic lights and convenience stores. The normal world reasserted itself, making the events of the night feel increasingly surreal, dreamlike. We stopped for gas in Bluff around 8:30 a.m. Raymond pumped while I went inside to pay and grab coffee. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the darkness, the aisles filled with ordinary things: candy bars, magazines, motor oil. A middle-aged woman worked the register, barely glancing at us as she processed the transaction. Everything was aggressively normal, almost offensively so, after what we'd experienced. Back in the truck, we continued west through the Utah desert. Raymond finally spoke around 10 a.m., breaking hours of silence. "Julian, what do we tell people?" I'd been thinking about the same question, turning it over in my mind repeatedly. "Nothing," I said finally. "We tell them nothing." "But who would believe us?" I interrupted. "Who could we tell this to without sounding completely insane?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the passing landscape. "So we just forget about it? Can you?" I asked honestly. "No," he admitted quietly. "I don't think I ever will." By the time we crossed into Utah proper, the sun was bright overhead, the landscape empty and open under clear blue skies. Even in the broad daylight, the memories from the darkness clung stubbornly, refusing to fade. Every time I closed my eyes, even for a moment, I saw that figure on the ridge, heard that howl echoing across the valley. We drove straight through to Santa Fe, stopping only for gas and food. The truck ran fine, the radiator holding steady, as if the breakdown had never happened. By the time we pulled into my driveway around 8 p.m., we'd been awake for nearly 40 hours straight. Raymond gathered his camera equipment, still unused, the photos never taken, and headed to his car without much ceremony. We'd barely spoken for the last 100 miles, both lost in our own thoughts. "Raymond," I called as he opened his car door. He turned, looking exhausted, years older than he had 2 days ago. "We don't talk about this," I said firmly. "Not to anyone, not ever." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, okay." A few days later, back home in Santa Fe, I found myself sitting on the front porch, staring numbly into space, the phone loosely in my hand. All the planned sightseeing, photographs, and stories we'd meant to gather had vanished, replaced by the uneasy weight of something we couldn't explain, something that still lingered at the edge of our consciousness. The planned family dinner to share our photos and stories had been quietly canceled. Raymond had called in sick to work for 3 days straight. I'd returned to the oil fields but found myself distracted, jumping at shadows, finishing my routes earlier than necessary to avoid being caught out after dark. My phone buzzed sharply, startling me from my thoughts. It was Raymond. A simple short text appeared on my screen. "Did you tell anyone?" I hesitated only briefly, then typed back a quick response. "No, let's never go back there." His reply came almost immediately. Agreed. I tossed the phone onto the table beside me, leaning back in my chair. Above, the sun was warm, the air calm and clear. Neighbors walked past on the sidewalk. Kids rode bikes. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Life continued exactly as it had before, indifferent to what Raymond and I had witnessed in Red Valley. Yet somewhere deep inside, the howl still echoed, distant but unmistakable, rising slowly like a forgotten memory that refused to fade away. I knew with absolute certainty that I would hear that sound for the rest of my life, in quiet moments, in darkness, in the space between waking and sleeping. Whatever we'd encountered in those canyons, it had marked us somehow, changed us in ways I was only beginning to understand. The world felt different now, larger and more dangerous, filled with things that existed just beyond the edge of firelight and human understanding. I never drove through Navajo country again. Even years later, working different fields in different states, I avoided Route 191 and everything north of Farmington. Some shortcuts, I learned, weren't worth taking. Some photographs weren't worth capturing. And some things, once seen, could never be unseen, no matter how desperately you wanted to forget. The memory lived on, persistent and patient, waiting in the darkness of Red Valley for the next traveler foolish enough to break down under a thin moon, surrounded by ridges where ancient things still moved between the canyons, watching and waiting with yellow eyes that never blinked. I never meant to become a witness to something beyond human comprehension. My name is Eldon Matthews, and before the events I'm about to recount, I was just another corporate burnout seeking solace in nature's embrace. The Fire Lookout Tower in Shoshone National Forest, Wyoming, became my refuge, a solitary perch between earth and sky where I thought I could rebuild myself. The decision to become a fire watcher came after 15 years in corporate finance in Denver. 15 years of spreadsheets, meetings, and slowly dying inside. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. No screaming matches or desk-flipping episodes. Just a quiet Tuesday morning when I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly alive. My resignation letter was brief. My apartment lease cancellation even briefer. Within a month, I'd traded my downtown condo for a Spartan Tower cabin perched on the edge of 500,000 acres of wilderness. The Forest Service seemed almost desperate to fill the position, something I should have perhaps questioned more carefully at the time. The tower itself was a testament to functional minimalism. A 14 by 14 foot cabin atop a 60-foot steel frame, equipped with the basics for survival and surveillance. A bed, a small kitchen, radio equipment and windows on all sides offering an unobstructed view of the vast forest below. Solar panels provided power for essential equipment, and a rainwater collection system supplemented my water supply. The first 2 months were exactly what I needed. Days fell into a comfortable rhythm of morning radio checks, hourly surveillance sweeps, weather monitoring, and maintenance tasks. I learned to read the forest like a book, the way shadows moved across the canopy, how different types of smoke carried different messages, the countless subtle signs that spelled either safety or danger for the wilderness under my watch. Ranger Lytris, Sarah Lytris, made weekly supply runs to the tower. She was in her early 40s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors and eyes that seemed to catch everything. Our conversations were brief but welcome breaks in my solitude. She knew every trail, every stream, every quirk of the forest, and her obvious love for this land helped me feel less like an outsider. "You're settling in well," she told me during one of her visits in early June. "Most city folks don't last a month up here. The silence gets to them." I knew what she meant. The silence up here wasn't really silence at all. It was an absence of human noise filled with the countless small sounds of nature. Wind through pine needles, bird calls, the creak of trees, the distant cry of an elk. At night, when the darkness pressed against my windows like a living thing, those sounds became my companions. But everything changed the week the wildfires started. It began with a series of lightning strikes in the northern section of my watch area. Small fires at first. Nothing unusual for early summer. But then the wind patterns shifted, temperatures spiked, and suddenly we had a crisis brewing. The Forest Service brought in additional firefighting crews, and my radio crackled constantly with updates and coordinates. That's when I first noticed the void. It was during one of my regular sweeps with binoculars, tracking the smoke patterns. when something caught my eye. About 3 miles northeast of my tower, there was a section of forest that looked wrong. The canopy there had a gap, perfectly circular, maybe 50 yards across. Not a clearing. I had those marked on my maps, and not fire damage. It was as if something had simply removed a chunk of forest, leaving nothing but shadow behind. I reported it during my next radio check, but with the fires demanding everyone's attention, it was logged as a low-priority observation. Probably storm damage, the dispatcher suggested. We'll have someone check it out when things calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The void seemed to absorb light differently than natural clearings, and sometimes, when I trained my binoculars on it for too long, I could swear I saw movement in its depths, fluid, purposeful movement that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on it. Then the hikers started going missing. The first report came through on a Wednesday morning. A couple from Idaho, experienced backpackers, hadn't checked in at their designated waypoint. Their last known location, less than a mile from that strange clearing I'd observed. Keep an eye out for any smoke signals or distress beacons. Sarah told me during her supply run that afternoon. She seemed more concerned than usual, her normally steady hands fidgeting with her pack straps. Search and rescue is already out there, but extra eyes never hurt. 3 days later, another report. A solo hiker this time, a wildlife photographer who'd ventured off-trail to track elk movements. His emergency beacon had activated briefly near, you guessed it, that same area, then gone silent. I began plotting the disappearances on my maps, creating a pattern that drew an unsettling picture. Every incident centered around that mysterious clearing, like moths drawn to a flame. When I shared my observations with Sarah, she fell into an unusual silence. "There's something I should tell you," she said finally, her voice low despite us being alone in the tower. "This isn't the first time we've had incidents in that area. Every few years people go missing. Sometimes we find them, sometimes we don't. Those we do find, they're never quite right afterward. They can't or won't talk about what happened to them." She wouldn't elaborate further, but that night, as I stood at my window staring out at the darkened forest, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The void in the canopy had moved. Not far, maybe 100 yards from its previous position, but I was certain. I checked my earlier photographs against my current view, and there was no doubt. The clearing was mobile. The discovery that the clearing could move changed everything. I began keeping detailed logs of its position, photographing it at different times of day, trying to understand its patterns. The movement wasn't random. It seemed to follow game trails, always staying within a roughly circular area about 2 miles in diameter. One morning in late June, Sarah's weekly supply run came early. She practically burst into my cabin, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained urgency. "We found something," she said, dropping her pack on my floor. "Search team came across an abandoned campsite near your moving clearing. You need to see this." The site was about a mile from my tower, close enough that we could hike there and back before dark. As we walked, Sarah filled me in on the details. The camp had been discovered by a rescue team searching for the missing photographer. What they found had been disturbing enough that they'd called her immediately. When we reached the site, I understood why. 2 tents stood perfectly intact. Yet something was deeply wrong about the scene. The tent's doors gaped open, sleeping bags and personal items scattered as if their occupants had fled in panic. A cooking pot still hung over the long cold remains of a fire, its contents untouched. High-end camping gear, the kind that experienced hikers don't simply abandon, lay strewn about. But it was the ground that caught my attention. The earth around the campsite was marked with tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen. They resembled bear prints in size, but the shape was all wrong. Too many toes, each ending in what looked like hooked claws. And the stride length suggested something that walked upright. "Look at this," Sarah called from near one of the tents. She pointed to deep gouges in a nearby tree trunk, about 8 feet off the ground. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still pale. Whatever made these was big, really big. As we documented the scene, I noticed something else: silence. No birds, no insects, not even wind in the trees. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't identify, but that made every hair on my body stand on end. We found the first bone near the edge of the campsite. It lay partially buried in leaves, bleached white by sun and weather. At first glance it looked human, a femur maybe, but closer inspection revealed subtle wrongness. The proportions were off, and the surface was marked with strange striations that no natural process could explain. "We should go," Sarah said suddenly, her voice tight. "It's getting dark." She was right. Shadows had lengthened while we investigated, and the forest had taken on that peculiar quality of light that precedes dusk. As we hurried back toward my tower, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next few days passed in a blur of increasing tension. The void in the forest moved more frequently now, and always closer to my tower. Each night, the silence grew deeper, heavier, more pregnant with possibility. Sleep became impossible. I spent hours at my windows, scanning the darkness with binoculars, jumping at every shadow. Sarah's radio calls became my lifeline to sanity. We spoke several times a day, sharing observations and theories. She'd begun researching local legends, looking for anything that might explain what we were dealing with. Native American stories spoke of a creature that walked the forests, neither animal nor spirit, that fed on more than just flesh. European settlers had their own tales of something that could move through trees like a fish through water, that left nothing behind but silence and bones. The night everything came to a head, I was making my final sweep before sunset. The void had moved again, now less than half a mile from my tower. Through my binoculars, I saw something that made my heart stop. Movement at the edge of the clearing, not the fluid, shadow-like motion I'd observed before, but something solid, massive, emerging from the darkness. My radio crackled. "Eldon?" Sarah's voice was breathless, urgent. "Inbound. New development. Don't." Static swallowed the rest of her message. "Sarah? Come in, Sarah." Nothing but white noise answered. I knew I should stay in the tower. Every survival instinct screamed at me to lock the door, call for help, wait for morning. But if Sarah was out there, possibly in danger, the decision made itself. I grabbed my emergency pack, flashlight, and the hunting rifle I wasn't technically supposed to have. The sun had nearly set as I started down the tower stairs, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. The forest floor was alien in the growing darkness. Familiar trails seemed subtly wrong, landmarks out of place. I followed Sarah's usual route, moving as quietly as years of hiking had taught me. The silence was absolute now, broken only by my own careful footsteps and increasingly rapid breathing. I found her vehicle first, parked haphazardly on the access road. The driver's door stood open, her radio lying in the dirt nearby. A trail of disturbed undergrowth led toward the clearing. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in any natural forest. A low, rhythmic clicking like massive bones knocking together. It came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me in the darkness. My flashlight beam caught movement ahead. Something huge shifted in the shadows, something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. As I watched, frozen in terror, it resolved into a form that defied comprehension. It stood upright, easily 10 feet tall, its body a contradiction of shapes that seemed to change every time my eyes tried to focus on them. Fur that wasn't quite fur covered its frame, moving wrong, like dark water flowing uphill. Its head was the worst part, a face that suggested humanity in the same way a corpse suggests the person it used to be, with too many eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like wells of liquid night. Sarah lay crumpled at its feet, unconscious, or I couldn't let myself think about the alternative. The creature moved with impossible speed. One moment it was 30 yards away. The next it was almost upon me. I fired the rifle without conscious thought, the shot deafening in the unnatural silence. The bullet struck true. I heard the impact, but the thing didn't even flinch. I ran. What followed was a nightmare of crashing through undergrowth, leaping fallen logs, scrambling over rocks. The creature pursued with terrible purpose, its clicking sound growing closer no matter how fast I moved. My lungs burned, muscles screamed, but terror drove me onward. The tower loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. I hit the stairs running, taking them 2 at a time, the metal ringing with my footsteps. Behind me, something massive hit the tower's base, making the entire structure sway. I slammed the cabin door shut, fumbling with the locks. Through the windows, I could see it circling the tower's base, moving with fluid grace that violated physics. Its clicking had changed pitch, becoming almost musical. For hours it prowled below, while I huddled in the cabin, clutching my useless rifle. As dawn approached, the clicking gradually faded. When I finally dared to look out again, the creature was gone. The void in the forest had moved as well, now several miles distant. They found Sarah 2 days later, alive but unresponsive. She lay exactly where I'd seen her fall, without a mark on her body. The doctors called it a coma, but her brain scans showed activity patterns they'd never seen before. She woke after a week, but the woman who opened her eyes wasn't the Sarah I knew. She didn't speak, didn't seem to recognize anyone. Her eyes held a knowledge that no human was meant to possess. I submitted my resignation from the fire watch position the day Sarah was found. The official report cited natural causes for the incidents: bear attacks, exposure, unfortunate accidents. The void in the forest was dismissed as a trick of light and shadow. Life in Shoshone National Forest returned to normal. But I know the truth. Sometimes on dark nights when sleep eludes me, I pull out the maps I kept, the photographs I took, the journal where I documented everything. The void still moves through those woods, though no one watches it now. The creature still hunts, though its existence remains unacknowledged. And sometimes when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear that clicking sound, calling me back to the forest, back to the truth I discovered in that dark tower. But I'll never go back. Some knowledge comes at too high a price, and some mysteries are better left in shadow. The thing about small towns is they have a way of holding on to their secrets. Ashton, Arkansas was no different. Nestled in the shadow of the Ozarks where the mountains meet the Mississippi Delta, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. But some secrets run deeper than town gossip. My name is Eli Turner, and in 1988, I was about as green as they come on the Ashton police force. Fresh out of the academy with a shiny badge and a head full of procedures, I thought I knew everything there was to know about law enforcement. My wife Amy would laugh at that now. She was already carrying our first child, and her work as an ER nurse had given her a far more practical education in human nature than any academy could provide. We'd bought a small starter home on Cedar Street, one of those modest affairs with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that needed more attention than our budget could spare. But it was ours, and with a baby on the way, it felt like the beginning of something real. Amy had decorated the nursery in soft yellows and greens. We wanted the gender to be a surprise, and I'd spend my off hours trying to fix up the place, usually making more of a mess than I fixed. The night shift wasn't anyone's first choice, but as the rookie I didn't have much say in the matter. Besides, Ashton after dark had its own kind of charm. The streets would empty out except for the occasional trucker passing through, or the regulars at Betty Ann's Diner, where the coffee was strong enough to strip paint and the pie could make you forget your troubles, at least for a while. Betty Ann herself was a fixture behind the counter, a woman who'd seen enough of life to have an opinion on everything and everyone. She'd been serving coffee and wisdom to Ashton's finest since before I was born, and she took it upon herself to properly train me in the ways of small-town policing. "You watch Old Man Miller's place on Thursday nights," she'd tell me, topping off my coffee. "That's when his boy comes around trying to sweet-talk him out of his pension check. And don't let Martha Jenkins' complaints about noise at the Thompson place fool you. She's just sweet on Bill Thompson and too proud to admit it." I'd laugh and take notes, mental and otherwise. In a town like Ashton, this kind of intelligence was worth more than any police manual. My partner during training had been James Orson, a 20-year veteran who'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by much. He was the kind of cop they don't make anymore, part social worker, part philosopher, and all lawman. We'd clicked right away, maybe because he saw something of himself in my eagerness, or maybe because he just needed someone to pass his stories on to. "Remember, kid," he'd say, his weathered face creased with a smile. "Out here, we're not just enforcing the law, we're keeping the peace. Sometimes that means knowing when to look the other way, and sometimes it means being the only thing standing between folks and whatever's out there in the dark." I didn't understand what he meant by that last part. Not then. But I would. June 5th, 1988 started like any other night shift. I kissed Amy goodbye, my hand lingering on her growing belly, and headed out into the humid Arkansas evening. The air was thick with the smell of honeysuckle and distant rain, and the cicadas were singing their endless summer song. I remember thinking how peaceful it all was, how perfectly normal. My first stop, as always, was Betty Ann's. The regulars were in their usual spots. Tom Webster nursing his eternal cup of coffee, Jenny Martinez finishing up her waitressing shift, and Betty Ann herself holding court from behind the counter. The conversations were the same as always, complaints about the weather, gossip about who was feuding with whom, and speculation about when the Martin boy would finally propose to the Cooper girl. "Careful out there tonight, Eli," Betty Ann said as I was leaving, and something in her tone made me pause. Weather's fixing to turn, and strange things happen when the storms roll in from the mountains. I laughed it off, but there was something in her eyes that stayed with me. Later I'd wonder if she'd known something, if maybe there were stories passed down through generations of Ashton residents that might have warned me about what was coming. The first few hours of my shift were routine. A couple of traffic stops, a noise complaint at the old Wilson place that turned out to be nothing more than a raccoon in the trash, and the usual patrol routes through Ashton's quiet streets. The storm Betty Ann had mentioned was building in the distance, heat lightning playing across the clouds and thunder rolling through the hills like distant drums. Around 2 a.m., everything changed. The call came in over the radio, dispatch's usual professional tone cracking slightly around the edges. A woman, hysterical, reporting something in the woods off Route 9. The description was fragmented, confused, something about eyes in the darkness, about movement that wasn't quite right, about sounds that shouldn't exist in nature. Standard procedure would have been to write it off as either an overactive imagination or drugs, maybe both. But something in the woman's voice, the raw terror beneath the hysteria, made my skin crawl. I radioed in that I would investigate, trying to keep my own voice steady and professional. As I turned onto Route 9, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving into something I wasn't prepared for. Something that would change everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. I didn't know it then, but that night would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would follow me for decades to come. A darkness that would sink its claws into my life and never fully let go. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, I have to tell you about what I found in those woods, about the eyes that haunted my dreams, and about the monster that taught me that sometimes the things we're afraid of in the dark are real after all. And maybe, just maybe, they're afraid of us too. Route 9 twisted through some of the densest forest in the county. A narrow strip of asphalt barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. The rain was coming down harder now, creating a shifting curtain in my headlights. Every few seconds lightning would illuminate the woods in stark frozen tableaus, turning the trees into reaching skeletal fingers against the sky. The woman who'd called, Sarah Mitchell, according to dispatch, had reported seeing something near the old Carson property, about 5 miles out of town. The Carsons had abandoned the place years ago after a fire, leaving nothing but a crumbling foundation and local legends about bad luck and strange noises in the night. I pulled onto the overgrown access road, the cruiser's tires crunching over gravel and dead leaves. The rain drummed on the roof, and my wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. Something about the whole scene felt wrong. The way the shadows seemed to move independently of the trees, the unnatural silence beneath the storm. Protocol said.
I should wait for backup.
Orson's voice echoed in my head. Better to be alive and embarrassed than dead and proud. But pride wasn't what made me step out of that cruiser. It was something else. Something I still can't fully explain. A need to know, maybe. Or fate, if you believe in such things. The beam of my flashlight cut through the rain, picking out details that seemed designed to unsettle. A child's toy, half buried in mud. The remains of an old tire swing, its rope black with rot, broken glass that caught the light like teeth. I radioed my position to dispatch, trying to ignore how the static seemed to grow stronger with each step I took away from the car. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not quite a growl. Not quite a moan, but something in between. Something that made every hair on my body stand on end. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, and for a split second I caught them. 2 eyes, reflecting the light with an unnatural yellow glow. They were about 20 feet up. No bear stands that tall. No mountain lion. Nothing that should exist in the Arkansas woods or anywhere else. But there they were, and they were looking right at me. The human mind isn't built to process certain things. When reality breaks, it tries to piece it back together in ways that make sense. That's why my first thought, absurd as it seems now, was someone's playing a joke. But as the creature stepped forward, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare taking solid form, I knew this was no joke. It moved like a predator, but wrong. Too fluid for its size, too deliberate. The rain matted its dark gray hide, which wasn't fur or scales but something in between. Its proportions were a twisted mockery of human form, with arms too long and joints that bent in ways they shouldn't. But it was the face that broke me. A wolf's head, but larger, more primal, with a jaw that could probably snap me in half without trying. Those yellow eyes held an intelligence that was almost worse than mindless savagery. This thing knew what it was doing. I'd like to say I acted with professional courage, that I followed procedure or at least put up a fight. But when that thing opened its mouth, revealing rows of teeth that gleamed in the flashlight beam, and let out a sound that was part roar and part scream, I did the only thing my body would let me do. I ran. The cruiser might as well have been 100 miles away. I could hear it behind me. Not just its footfalls, which shook the ground, but its breathing, heavy and wet, and getting closer. The rain had turned the ground into a treacherous mess of mud and hidden roots. I slipped, caught myself, kept running. My training finally kicked in enough to remember my gun. I turned, still running, and fired. The shots were wild, but at least one must have hit because the creature's roar changed pitch, becoming higher, angrier. Instead of deterring it, I just made it mad. I reached the cruiser and threw myself inside, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life just as something massive slammed into the driver's side door, leaving a dent the size of a tire. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase. The creature kept pace easily, those yellow eyes never leaving mine in the rearview mirror. It moved with impossible speed, eating up the ground with long strides. I had the accelerator pressed to the floor, but the rain-slicked road made every turn a gamble. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life but nearly ended it first. I took the logging road. It was barely more than a trail. Tight turns between trees that scraped the cruiser's sides. The creature was forced to slow down, the space too narrow for its bulk to move freely. Then the engine died. The silence after the engine cut out was absolute. No more roar of the motor, no more squeal of tires, just the rain and my own ragged breathing. And something else. Heavy footfalls, getting closer. I had a choice to make. Stay in the car and be trapped, or run and maybe find a way to survive. The decision was made for me, when massive claws ripped through the roof of the cruiser like it was paper. I burst out of the car and into the woods. The undergrowth was dense here, thorns tearing at my uniform as I pushed through. I could hear the creature behind me, its frustration evident in its roars as the thick vegetation slowed it down. The embankment caught me by surprise. One moment I was running, the next I was falling, tumbling through space. The impact drove the air from my lungs and sent waves of pain through my body. As I lay there, dazed and hurting, I waited for the end, but it didn't come. Instead, I heard sirens in the distance. Backup, finally arriving, drawn by the gunshots, or maybe my last radio call. The creature's roars became more distant, fading into the depths of the forest. The official report read like a bad joke. Officer involved in vehicle accident while pursuing suspect into wooded area. Suspect escaped. Vehicle recovered with extensive damage consistent with collision with large tree. No one believed my initial attempts to tell the truth. Even Orson, who'd seen his share of strange things, advised me to keep quiet. Some stories, he said, are better left untold. The nickname started a few weeks later. Monster Cop. At first it was just whispers, then jokes at my expense. Even Betty Ann couldn't keep the concern from her eyes when I'd stop in for coffee. The only person who never doubted me was Amy. She'd seen the look in my eyes when I finally made it home that night, seen the way my hands shook when I tried to explain. Our daughter was born 2 months later, healthy, beautiful, and blissfully unaware of the darkness that had entered our lives. We named her Sarah, though I never told Amy it was the same name as the woman who'd made the call that night. We never found Sarah Mitchell, by the way. No one by that name lived in Ashton or any of the surrounding towns. We left Ashton 6 months later, headed west to Nevada, where the desert felt safer somehow. Fewer shadows, fewer places for monsters to hide. I took a job with a small department there, started over. Amy found work at a local hospital, and Sarah grew into a bright, curious child who loved to hear stories, though never the one that had driven us from our home. The years passed. The nightmares became less frequent, though they never fully went away. I'd wake up sometimes, sweat-soaked and shaking, those yellow eyes still burning in my mind. Amy would hold me, not asking questions, just being there. Then came the newspaper article. It was 20 years after that night when Amy showed me the paper. A series of livestock mutilations near Ashton, descriptions of a massive wolf-like creature, a blurry photograph that made my blood run cold. The eyes in the photo were exactly as I remembered them, that same unnatural yellow glow. I knew then that it hadn't ended that night in the rain. The creature was still out there, maybe others like it, hunting in the shadows of the Ozarks. The question wasn't whether I would go back. I had to. The real question was what I would find when I did. The monster had haunted my dreams for 2 decades. Now it was time to face it in the waking world. This time, I wouldn't be the rookie cop running scared. This time, I would be ready. But as I packed my bag and checked my gun, a thought kept nagging at me. Maybe the creature had been waiting all these years too. Maybe it remembered me as clearly as I remembered it. And maybe, just maybe, it had been looking forward to our reunion as much as I had. I'm writing this down now, because people deserve to know the truth about what's out there in the dark, about the things we tell ourselves can't exist. But mostly, I'm writing it because I'm heading back to Ashton tomorrow, back to those woods where it all began. If you're reading this, it means one of 2 things. Either I survived and finally decided the world needs to know, or I didn't, and this account is all that's left to warn others about what lurks in the shadows of the Ozarks. Either way, remember this: the monsters are real. They're out there, watching and waiting, and sometimes on dark nights when the rain falls and thunder rolls through the hills, they come hunting. But so do I. My name is Fernando Ramirez, and I've spent the last 3 years trying to make sense of what happened to me at Flat Rock Ridge. Before I tell you about the creature, the thing the locals call Silas, you need to understand who I was before that August night in 2020 changed everything. I'd worked as a mechanic in Flagstaff since I was 18, following in my father's footsteps. There's something honest about fixing cars. Problems have solutions. Parts either work or they don't. No gray areas, no uncertainties. Just the familiar smell of motor oil and the satisfying click of tools against metal. Gonzalez Auto Repair became my second home, a place where I could lose myself in the rhythms of routine maintenance and complex repairs. Growing up in northern Arizona, I'd always been drawn to the outdoors. My mother used to say I was born with wanderlust in my veins. Every chance I got, I'd head into the wilderness, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. The Coconino National Forest was my playground, and I'd spent countless weekends exploring its trails, camping under its stars, and learning its secrets. Or at least I thought I knew its secrets. That's how I met Mike Thompson. He brought his beat-up Ford F-150 into the shop one day, complaining about the transmission. While I worked on his truck, we got to talking about hiking and camping. Mike was a former park ranger who'd settled into teaching high school biology. He had this way of looking at nature, not just seeing its beauty, but understanding its systems, its delicate balances. We became fast friends, bonding over campfires and trail maps. The summer of 2020 had been brutal. The pandemic had everyone on edge, and the garage was understaffed. I was pulling 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, trying to keep up with the endless stream of repairs. The stress was getting to me. I wasn't sleeping well, my temper was short, and the walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in. That's when I remembered Flat Rock Ridge. I'd heard about it from an old customer, a retired trucker who spoke about it with a strange mix of reverence and unease. It's not on any map, he told me, sketching directions on a napkin. But if you're looking to get away from everything, that's the place. The ridge sat in a remote corner of Montana, far from the usual tourist trails. The closest town was a speck on the map called Millerton, population barely breaking 300. So I spent weeks planning the trip, studying satellite images, checking weather patterns, and preparing my RV, a 2015 Winnebago I'd bought cheap and restored myself. Mike thought I was crazy to drive all that way. There are plenty of quiet spots closer to home, he'd said when I told him my plans. But something about Flat Rock Ridge called to me. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was something else, something I couldn't quite name. I packed carefully. Enough supplies for 2 weeks. Emergency equipment, my hunting rifle, a Remington 700 that had belonged to my father, and basic tools. The drive north took 3 days. I watched the landscape change from desert scrub to rolling hills to dense forest. The further I got from civilization, the lighter I felt, as if I was shedding layers of stress with each mile. The last stretch was the hardest. 20 miles of dirt road that tested every repair I'd made to the RV. But when I finally reached the ridge, I knew it had been worth it. The setting sun painted the sky in impossible colors, and the sound of the river below was like nature's own lullaby. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs that I missed or dismissed. The unusual silence of the birds. The strange markings on the trees that I attributed to natural causes. The feeling of being watched that I blamed on isolation. But hindsight has a way of making everything clearer, doesn't it? That first night was deceptively peaceful. I set up camp near the river, the massive bulk of the ridge rising behind me like an ancient wall. The stars came out, brighter than I'd ever seen them, and I sat by my campfire drinking beer and listening to the river's song. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. The next morning I decided to explore. The trail up the ridge was overgrown but still visible, switching back and forth across the steep slope. The forest here was old, really old. The trees were giants, their trunks wider than my RV in some places. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. That's when I found the cabin. It sat in a small clearing about halfway up the ridge, looking like something out of a ghost story. The roof had partially collapsed, and vines crawled up the walls like grasping fingers. But it was the door that caught my attention. It hung at an odd angle, too tall and narrow for its frame, as if it had been built for something that wasn't quite human. Inside, the cabin was a single room, mostly empty except for a rusted iron stove and what might have once been a bed frame. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the gloom. But it was the walls that caught my attention. They were covered in carvings, hundreds of them, overlapping and intertwining in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. Some were recognizable: deer, bears, human figures. But others were something else entirely. Twisted shapes that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. And everywhere, a recurring symbol. A vertical line with 3 curved branches, like a warped tree or a deformed hand reaching upward. On a crude table by the window, I found the newspaper. August 15th, 1984. The headline was about a local missing persons case. 3 hikers who'd vanished without a trace near Flat Rock Ridge. The paper was perfectly preserved, as if someone had left it there yesterday. That should have been my first real warning. That night the dreams started. I was running through endless dark woods, pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel, a presence that radiated ancient malevolence. I woke in a cold sweat, the RV suddenly feeling too small, too vulnerable. The sounds began the next day. At first, just subtle things. Branches breaking in the distance, rustling in the underbrush that didn't match the wind. But then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, circling my campsite just beyond the firelight's reach. And the whispers. God, the whispers. They weren't in any language I knew, but they carried meaning nonetheless. You don't belong here. Leave. Run. I tried to convince myself it was just wildlife, just my imagination playing tricks. But then I found the tracks. They circled the RV in a perfect pattern, each print deeper than my hand and shaped all wrong, too many toes, each ending in what looked like a curved talon. I took photos, measured them, tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It showed itself on the 3rd night. I was sitting by the fire, rifle across my lap, when the forest went silent. Not just quiet, silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath. The fire dimmed, though there was no wind, and the shadows seemed to thicken like tar. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a massive pine. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 9 feet. Its limbs were too long, too thin, jointed in ways that defied anatomy. But its face, God help me, its face. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, pale bark-like skin, except for the eyes. They glowed with a faint bluish light, like foxfire in deep woods. I raised my rifle, hands shaking, and fired. The sound was shockingly loud in the unnatural silence. The creature didn't flinch, didn't move, just kept watching me with those glowing eyes. I fired again and again. Each bullet should have torn through flesh and bone, but the thing showed no reaction. Then it moved. Not walking, not running, but gliding, as if it was being pulled forward on invisible strings. Its arms unfolded like branches in the wind, reaching for me with fingers that were too long, too numerous. I ran. I made it back to civilization, but the story doesn't end there. The thing, Silas, as I later learned it was called, had marked me somehow. I couldn't sleep without seeing those eyes in my dreams. Couldn't walk in woods without feeling watched. My life became divided into two parts, before Flat Rock Ridge and after. That's when I called Mike. He listened to my story without interruption, without judgment. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've heard stories, not about this exact thing, but similar. There are places in the wilderness where reality is thin, where things can slip through from somewhere else." We went back together a week later, armed with cameras, better weapons and equipment for documenting whatever we found. The cabin was still there, but changed. The carvings on the walls were fresher, more numerous, and in the center of the floor we found a trapdoor that I swear hadn't been there before. What we discovered in our investigation still haunts me. Through research and interviews with locals, we pieced together a history of disappearances stretching back over a century. Always in the same area, always following the same pattern. People would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only footprints that didn't match any known animal. The name Silas came from an old journal we found in the Millerton Library, written by a trapper in 1892. He described encounters with a guardian spirit that the local Native Americans called by a name that roughly translated to the one who watches from trees. Over time, settlers shortened it to Silas, but that name gives it too much humanity. What we saw that final night, when we staked out the cabin, was anything but human. It emerged from between the trees like smoke given form, its body constantly shifting and changing. The cameras failed to capture it. Every photo showed only a blur, a smear of darkness where something solid should have been. We weren't prepared for its power. When it came for us, the very air seemed to thicken and distort. Our bullets passed through it like it was made of mist. It moved with impossible speed, cutting off our escape routes, herding us toward the cabin, toward that trapdoor. Mike saved my life. He shoved me toward the RV, screaming at me to run while he provided covering fire. The last I saw of him, he was emptying his rifle into the creature's advancing form. I heard his scream cut off midway as I started the engine. I reported him missing, of course. The search parties found nothing, just like all the others who'd vanished there over the years. I tried to tell them the truth, but who would believe it? A 9-foot-tall creature with glowing eyes that bullets couldn't harm. They wrote it off as another tragic hiking accident. That was 3 years ago. I still wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, hearing those whispers in a language that no human throat could produce. I've moved away from Flagstaff, away from the mountains and forests. I live in Phoenix now, surrounded by desert and concrete. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I catch a scent of pine needles and damp earth. And in those moments, I swear I can feel it watching me. Even here, hundreds of miles from Flat Rock Ridge. Those glowing eyes in the darkness. That reaching hand with too many fingers. I know now why that place isn't on any maps. Some places shouldn't be found. Some things shouldn't be disturbed. Silas is still there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if a part of me is still there too, running through those dark woods, pursued by something that has no name in any human tongue. Is Mike still alive somewhere in those woods? Did he find what was beneath that trapdoor? I don't know. I don't want to know. All I know is that the wilderness holds secrets darker and older than humanity can comprehend. And sometimes, if you stray too far from the marked trails, you might find them. Or worse, they might find you.